Hello and welcome to the Proceed podcast, the podcast where we dive into the world of SAP data management. I'm your host, Rebecca, and today I'm joined by one of our account managers here at Proceed, Philip Larkin. We're going to be talking about the S4HANA journey, but more specifically the Brownfield migration. In this episode, we're really looking at the archiving strategy and what businesses need to be thinking about as they look at how to reduce their data footprint, both before the S4HANA journey, but also once they're in HANA. So let's get started. Okay, so great. So first, let's just quickly say hello to our guest today, Philip. Hi, Philip.
Hi, Becky.
Hi. So to start off with, I thought it'd be good if you just introduce yourself quickly and maybe just mention you haven't been with the business for a huge amount of time. So maybe just talk a little bit about why you decided to join Proceed.
Sure, yeah. So I think, as you've said, I'm an account manager with Proceed. I've been here about 7 months at the time of recording. I worked for SAP for 13 years, mainly in services and usually in the data space, but also for a brief time also sold SAP HANA licenses for SAP. In terms of Proceed, well, I knew of Proceed by reputation. I'd worked with them when I was at SAP. There's a great working relationship. There always was a great working relationship with SAP, and the expertise of Proceed, SAP relied on in some cases, and Proceed are incredibly easy to work with. And so I think that expertise, the working relationship, the connection with SAP were really big factors bringing me here to Proceed.
Fab, thank you for that. And of course, it's great to have you here at Proceed. So let's get started with the first question. Why are customers choosing a brownfield migration over, say, a greenfield or bluefield?
Well, I mean, ideally, to get the best out of S4HANA, SAP wants customers to re-engineer business processes, either by adopting those in S4, by figuring out how they might adapt those processes. But to do it, customers need to involve their business users and leaders, and it can take time. And I think customers see value in it. They see areas where their business processes do need improving, but realistically, I think one of the drivers here as to why going to Brownfield and not doing that work at this point in time is because customers have got other business priorities, and they'll therefore be looking up to a future date where it's better for the business how to look at S4 features and how to adopt those at a later date and perhaps re-engineer some of their business processes. So Brownfield kind of gives customers the sort of stepping stone from, to get them compliant onto the latest version of SAP, and enables them to then have a stepping stone to thinking about, in future, I'm going to re-engineer some of my business processes and really take advantage of the stuff that SAP S4HANA is going to offer me.
And from a data perspective, the process becomes a lot less complex too.
Yeah, I think from a data perspective, there's less work to do with the Brownfield migration. For other approaches, customers have got to really work a bit more at how they're going to retain data, what data they're going to retain and what data to take into a new system. But if you're doing, effectively a system conversion of Brownfield, and in theory at least, you avoid that challenge. But data can't be ignored in the conversation. So, in the past, customers have not necessarily needed to work all that hard at managing their data of where it's stored. Perhaps their system performance is acceptable. The amount of data is easily managed by the database technology and storage was cheaper. So the benefits didn't necessarily justify the cost of implementing anything to reduce the data. But I think with SAP S4HANA, customers will need to care a lot more. I think moving to a modern infrastructure, modern in-memory database means that the cost is likely to be higher to store data within that infrastructure. So infrastructure costs, no matter how you do it, are likely to be higher or significantly higher. And that's what some customers are finding. So they shouldn't take all the data they don't need into S4HANA, and they shouldn't retain the data they do not need as they use their S4HANA system over time, and that will help them control costs.
Okay, so let's just talk about that a little bit. How can businesses go about reducing their data footprint in HANA?
Well, I think firstly, HANA gives some options. So only your hot data or business operational data should be stored in memory, and warm data, which may still be accessed but less frequently, and cold data, where for a small delay, quite possibly not noticeable to users, but where storage is really cheap. The existence of those options kind of gives you some sort of structure to think about where you're going to put data. And utilizing these properly can ensure that you're going to minimize your ongoing run costs for the infrastructure. So there's a couple of things businesses should be thinking about. I mean, one is, what's the best solution for retaining, using, housekeeping, or archiving the technical data that SAP needs to run, as this data is going to grow otherwise, and how much business or functional data do they really need to retain in hot or warm, and how much will go into cheap storage outside of HANA.
And what options do customers have for the data that no longer needs to be changed?
Well, ideally, I mean, customers need to remove data that no longer needs to be changed from HANA to an archive and make use of native storage extension. So I think there are, three things here. I think firstly, SAP by default stores technical data in the in-memory portion of HANA, and this can be a significant amount of data, and this can be removed and moved to native storage extensions, which would be cheaper. And also, you should look at things like the content server, for example. So the SAP Office data, which some customers may not even realize they use, should be moved to something like a content server outside of HANA altogether. And OpenText is one of the most common ones and is excellent, but there are other options for a content server. And this will help remove data from S/4HANA, but also help reduce the growth of data over time. And I think, as I've already mentioned, secondly, HANA comes with native storage extensions. You might think of it as kind of warm storage, and this gives the option for storing data outside in memory. And it may seem complex, but there's certain data which SAP generates, such as technical data, which really doesn't need the speed of an in-memory database to run. And if you configure native storage extensions correctly, it also makes it easy to remove this technical data when it's no longer required. And then thirdly, I suppose, get the data that you don't need to change into an archive on cheaper storage, either onto content server or file systems, effectively moving it into cold storage. It'll still come back quickly enough when you want to look at that data, if you choose the right storage solution.
Okay, and ideally, a customer will, or at least should, be thinking about this in the ECC system before they head to S/4HANA. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the good thing about archiving, housekeeping, and moving technical data is that these are things that you can do right now in ECC, and it'll mean moving less data when a customer goes on to SAP HANA, which will be better for cost control now in the future, and maybe make the project speed up and move to the new infrastructure. So as well as doing things like reducing the time for backup, restoring data, reducing potential errors in backups. And if you address it now, technical data would then have already been moved. Housekeeping routines have been implemented. Archiving routines will mostly work in S/4HANA for the functional archiving data. So even if you set those up in ECC, most of those won't need changing for S/4HANA. And those that do usually only require a little bit of work. So any investment in archiving in ECC will pay dividends when a customer is live, seeking to manage their data on S/4HANA.
Okay, and you talked a little bit about technical data there, which what we would call kind of those quick wins. But of course, to see the best results, you need to be thinking about your entire data landscape. So can you talk a little bit about the archiving strategy as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, so firstly, I suppose one of the first points to think about is recognizing that auditors, regulators, and people such as tax authorities want to know what happened to your data when you're moving it around, and customers all need to prove that it hasn't been deleted, or if it has, how and why. And so we've worked with a number of the key regulators and authorities around the world, and therefore the archive strategy, which encapsulates how you're going to archive that data into effectively read-only format. It's a document that you then show the auditors, regulators, and tax authorities, etc., to prove what you've done and are doing. And archiving is a continuous process as well, and the business will change, regulation will change, audit and other requirements will change. So the archive strategy isn't a one-off. It's very much a living document. And within that archiving strategy, though, is the implementation that you're following. And there's only one recommended safe way to archive functional data, and that's through using SAP archiving objects, either being the standard ones where they're available, which is for most things, or by creating custom archive objects for custom data. And where custom tables have been created, customers will want to archive that data as well, but need to create their own custom archive objects and archive enable the transactions to read that data. Some of the considerations for which archive objects are used, data in some tables can be archived by more than one object. So it really depends on the business context for the SAP system, and choosing the wrong archiving object or performing them in the wrong order can remove data that later archiving objects are looking for. And that creates a challenge because the later archiving objects won't run. It'll identify that data's missing. That'll kill the archiving project altogether. And we do work with customers who've tried it on their own, got into such problems, and we've had to go and rescue them. SAP do provide a network diagram which gives the right order for archive objects. So hopefully implementing in the wrong order using archive objects won't be a common problem.
And what about unstructured data?
Well, different customers are in kind of different positions for unstructured data. The Brownfield migration or system conversion is quite a good opportunity to either fix what they've been doing so far in the past regarding unstructured data or upgrade their infrastructure, which they may need to do anyway, based on what SAP supports in S/4HANA versus ECC. So we tend to see a couple of scenarios. Some customers are using the SAP DMS, and it'd be good to get that data out of the database. Doesn't need to be in memory and should go to a content server using cheaper storage. And then customers with a content server already will likely either want to upgrade or migrate to a newer version or potentially to a different content server, but that's not the whole story. And that's really because within a content server, there'll likely be a mixture of unstructured content. And if customer hasn't been managing it at all, then there could be quite a lot of content that should be removed, and that might also include archive files which are no longer required. So simply moving it will mean that they take more space than they might actually need, and therefore, again, that might translate to unnecessary cost in both the target system and the project to move the content to it. So for archive files, we recommend profiling these, understand what they are, which business objects they are connected to in SAP, figure out which ones can now simply be deleted. And then for other content, again, it's best to find out what's in there and what in SAP it's connected to, so you can make an informed decision about whether you need to keep it. And to do that, you really need to know where it's stored in the content server, which object it's connected to, what type of document, size, and some other information. I suppose another point is that there's a variety of tools to migrate content, but some don't work for all types of content, or for all source and target server variations, and some are known to be a little bit difficult to get to work properly. And when thinking about unstructured content, it's still got important content, and like the archiving strategy, where customer may need to show auditors, regulators, and other authorities for the data that's within the database, customer may need to do exactly the same for unstructured content. So when migrating the content to another content server, including a newer version, it may be necessary to prove that the content's been moved and provide a complete audit trail.
Okay, and you talked a little bit earlier about this, but could you cover some of the things that might go wrong with an archiving project? What customers or businesses might need to look out for?
So I suppose the first one maybe I've already covered, and then perhaps there's some additional points. So, as I said earlier, I think there's only one recommended safe way to archive functional data, and that's through SAP archiving objects. So, things to consider again, archiving things in the wrong order, making sure you choose the right or archiving object, and using the network diagram, fairly important. And then you get onto some other pieces, which are things like transactions not being complete. So SAP archiving is pretty smart, and it won't allow customers to archive where a business transaction hasn't completed. So an example might be where a purchase order was issued, say for 100 items, but only 90 were received. Thus, the SAP system thinks that the process hasn't completed, and it won't allow it to be archived. And that leaves it, as we would term it, as an open item. And businesses have run their companies for years with open items, but SAP won't allow them to be archived because it doesn't think that that transaction is completed. So it can be done, but if you don't identify them up front, you might get a nasty surprise when you try and archive in production, and where you won't remove anything like as much data as you thought. So we can address this, but it's important to look for these early, calling the experts if you have a lot of open items. And then I guess in some circumstances, it's possible to delete data in the wrong way. So HR data without archiving. And again, we've seen examples Most have been done, and the absence of data has prevented archiving running properly or caused other issues. And SAP itself is also pretty smart. So, it's based on data, and when data is removed, a few parts of SAP will look to recalculate, and that can be undesirable as it affects what SAP thinks the business results are for that period. It's important to know where these are and what SAP will do and take the steps to address it. So recalculation or restatements aren't triggered when all you're doing is just deleting data. And SAP does provide for this in most cases. Doing deletion the right way and knowing what you're doing and the effect it might have is therefore pretty important. And really, real expertise is needed in creating an archiving strategy because it is possible to get it wrong and damage your SAP system or indeed some of the dependent systems.
And again, we talked about regulations a few times, and this can make things a little bit more complicated too, right? Adhering to country-specific, industry-specific regulations.
I think for multinationals in particular, there's different requirements in different places for audit, tax, and other regulations. And we've worked in most geographies and industries, and we've got a pretty good understanding of what's required. But each customer may have a specific view of what should be retained in live, what can be retained but in an archive, and when it can be deleted. And it can depend on the country they're in, the type of business they're undertaking in that country, and other factors. So ideally, a customer should find out who in their business has that understanding. Not an awful lot of their time is required at all, but their input's really valuable in maximising the amount of data you can remove. Without it, customers can kind of set longer retention times than they might actually require. And if they've had SAP a long time, this can be a pretty good place to start. But if they've, because if you've had SAP for a long time, that might remove quite a lot of the data. And then you can adjust the retention periods a bit later on and make them smaller once the customer's got more information, or adjusted according to the geography, industry, business unit, or other things that will vary from business to business. Because it's worth bearing in mind that regulations change, and so you may need to change things as those regulations change, whether that's country specific or industry specific or a combination of both. So now's a good time to get a good understanding of what those are, because ideally you're trying to make your footprint in HANA as small as possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, that's the last of my questions. And wondering if you have anything else to add that you think we haven't covered.
So I think, I mean, there's some edge cases here, how the business uses the systems can be key. So when you look at archive data, so when you're using SAP and looking at archive data for in a lot of cases, there's really not much different to that and looking at the live data. But for some businesses, they want to see data in the context in which they use SAP. And SAP is so broad and capable that you've got so many different business users that use it, that providing archive data in the right business context may be the difference between getting the business on board for archiving or pushing back and saying they don't want to do it. So the archive strategy is not just about selecting the right archive objects, creating custom archive objects and running them all in the right order. It's also about how business actually uses SAP. So making sure that business people can view the archive data in the way in which they use SAP in their day-to-day is quite important. So having that understanding of the interdependencies between the SAP modules and how the customer actually uses them is important in creating the strategy. And so an example of that, and again, these are edge cases that don't apply to a great many customers, but they are there, consultancy or law firm, perhaps are running sales and distribution, project systems, for example, and they typically won't look at sales and distribution data in isolation. They tend to think that's pretty meaningless, and they want to see that data in the context of project systems when they're using project systems, and SAP just doesn't do that out of the box. There are too many variations about how businesses use it for SAP to cover every type of business use for out-of-the-box archiving. So I think that's one thing just to bear in mind, that there are going to be some customers out there that using SAP in a perhaps different way to the norm, and the archiving objects don't support that out of the box.
Right, so to close things off today, Philip, we do ask all of our guests the same question. We want to learn a little bit more about your listening habits. So what other podcast do you enjoy listening to?
So I listen to quite a lot, but I'm going to go for Goodfellows, which is also available on YouTube. It's from the Hoover Institution. It's an economist, a historian, a former general, talking about social stuff, economic stuff, geostrategic stuff. It's always really interesting to hear what they've got to say, and the interaction between them quite funny. The economist is John Cochrane, the historian's Niall Ferguson, who's a Scot, and HR McMaster, who's reasonably famous, is the general. So there's quite a good cast. They have special guests on as well, which are pretty insightful. Sometimes very, very American orientated, but sometimes they're just bringing on other people, really, kind of promoting the Hoover Institution, other fellows at the Hoover Institution. But of course, they've all got quite deep insights into whatever subject they're talking about.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, Becky.
And of course, if you, like many other companies, are just starting on your journey to S/4HANA and you're looking for some guidance with regards to best practices and the data strategy, you can head over to our website at proceedgroup.com. There's a number of resources on there, as well as some real-world examples from some of our customers, the challenges they've experienced and how, together with ourselves, they've overcome those. And of course, if you just want to have a chat with one of our experts, you can always give us a call or send an email over to us and we'll get back to you as well. Thank you very much for listening, and until next time.